Introduction to Joshua, English Standard Version Study Bible. Author and title. The book of Joshua is named for its leading character. For more on Joshua, see note on chapter 1, verse 1. The book's author, however, is not explicitly mentioned. The Talmud, a collection of ancient writings by rabbis on Jewish law and tradition, ascribes the book, with the exception of the account of Joshua's death, to Joshua himself. Baba Batra 15a. While the book depicts Joshua writing, Joshua chapter 8 verse 32, chapter 24 verse 26, it does not claim he wrote the book. Indeed, the repeated references to something existing to this day, see chapter 4 verse 9, chapter 5 verse 9, chapter 6 verse 25, etc., seem to suggest a significant lapse of time between the events and the book's final form. Also, the narrator in Joshua chapter 10 verse 13 cites what may be an earlier record of Joshua's deeds. Date. Determining the date of the book of Joshua is difficult because, as with many other Old Testament books, it may have been edited as it became part of the growing corpus of Old Testament texts. Its final editing may well have taken place in the exilic period, post 587 BC, but its original composition was likely much earlier. A number of features point to a date of origin in the late 2nd millennium BC. Theme. Joshua recounts part 2 of God's grandest work of redemption in the Old Testament period. In part 1, the Pentateuch, under the leadership of Moses, the Lord redeemed his people out of bondage in Egypt and formalized his covenantal love for them at Sinai. Now in part 2, under the leadership of Joshua, the Lord as divine warrior brings his people into the land of promise and gives them rest. Purpose, occasion, and background. From the evidence in the book itself, it appears that the purpose of the book of Joshua was to recount, from a theological perspective, the events surrounding Israel's capture and settlement of the land of Canaan, with particular emphasis on God's faithfulness in fulfilling his promise to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Such an account would have been relevant to ancient Israel from its earliest arrival in Canaan and to every subsequent generation of God's people to the present day. Literary background. Joshua comes immediately after the Pentateuch and in many ways completes its story. The theme of the first 5 books of the Bible is the progressive fulfillment of the patriarchal promise made first to Abraham, Genesis chapter 12 verses 1 through 3, and reiterated to him, his son Isaac, Genesis chapter 26 verses 2 through 4, and his grandson Jacob, Genesis chapter 28 verses 13 through 15, etc. Simply stated, the Lord promised Abraham and his descendants that they would be blessed and become a blessing, that they would grow to become a great nation, and that they would be given a land of their own. In addition, these blessings would be enjoyed in the context of a close covenant relationship with God. By the end of the Pentateuch, Israel has been brought into the blessing of covenant relationship with the Lord and has become a great people. But they remain outside the land of promise, on the plains of Moab. 40 years before, the Lord had raised up Moses to lead his people out of bondage in Egypt and to bring them to the land he had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Exodus chapter 3, verses 6 through 8, chapter 6, verses 2 through 8. Now after so many years of wandering, Joshua, the new Moses, Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 through 9, is to lead God's people into the land, take it, and divide it among them as their inheritance from the Lord. Historical background. See also Introduction to the Historical Books, pages 385 through 387. The dates of the Exodus and the conquest of the Promised Land are interrelated, since the conquest occurred about 40 years after the Exodus. Whether the Exodus occurred in the 15th century, about 1446, or 13th century, about 1260 BC, is a matter of long-standing debate among biblical scholars. See The Date of the Exodus, page 33. Were the Pharaoh of the Exodus explicitly named in the biblical text, this problem would be solved. But as was the custom in Egyptian records until about the 10th century BC, he is simply called Pharaoh. Deciding the date of the Exodus and conquest does not materially affect the interpretation of the Book of Joshua. Continuing archaeological work, both excavations and surface surveys, is providing helpful data, but this data requires interpretation and can often be correlated with either date of the conquest. With regard to the manner in which Israel came to be present in Canaan, several models have been suggested. According to the older conquest model, associated with W.F. Albright, the text of Joshua describes a rapid and highly destructive conquest. Advocates of this view were convinced that the 13th century provided the best archaeological confirmation. Subsequent work undermined Albright's model and its archaeological support. The unfortunate result of the collapse of Albright's conquest model was that many scholars wrongly assumed that the biblical testimony to a conquest was also discredited. More careful reading of the biblical text, however, reveals a conquest that is protracted and not necessarily very destructive of property, except in the case of those few cities burned: Jericho, Ai, and Hazor. See notes on chapter 11, verses 10 through 15. Other proposed models of Israel's emergence include the peaceful infiltration model, pioneered by A. Alt, the peasant revolt model of G. Mendenhall, and various more recent endogenous models, which assume Israel to have emerged from within Canaan rather than having entered from without. None of the standard models does full justice to the biblical evidence, but each may capture an aspect of the biblical portrayal. Military conquest certainly played a part in Israel's entry into Canaan, and archaeology provides at least some interesting correlations. See notes on chapter 6, verse 5, chapter 11, verses 10 through 15. Further, archaeological surface surveys indicate a rapid proliferation of small settlements in the central hill country, beginning in the late 13th century BC, whose inhabitants appear to have avoided eating pork. It is tempting to associate these new villages with the settling down of Israelites, perhaps after a longer or shorter period of existence as nomadic herdsmen in Canaan. Peaceful infiltration may have played some part in the settlement. Gibeon came under Israelite control without a fight, chapter 9, as did perhaps Shechem. See note on chapter 8, verses 30 through 33, and other sites. Revolt and realignment by disaffected Canaanites, such as Rahab, chapter 2, almost certainly contributed to Israel's mixed multitude. Compare with Exodus chapter 12, verse 38. So some degree of endogenous origin need not be ruled out. For background information on the man Joshua, see note on Joshua chapter 1, verse 1. The destruction of the Canaanites. The account in Joshua presents the sensitive reader with a deep problem, namely, the apparently wholesale slaughter of the indigenous Canaanite population in order to allow the people of Israel to occupy their land. How did Israel have any right to seize that land? And how can it be God's will for them to spare none of those who resisted them in defense of their own land? Could this be a level of barbarism that God tolerated in the Old Testament but now forbids in the New Testament? Certainly people hostile to the Bible decry ancient Israel for its ethnic cleansing, and many sensitive Christians find this deeply troubling as well. To handle this topic thoroughly would take a longer essay, but the discussion here can guide thoughts for fuller reflection. One must begin by acknowledging that the questions are legitimate. Christians rightly condemn this kind of behavior in other circumstances, and there is no warrant today for nations to destroy other nations in order to take their land. But there are special features of the command to Israel that both make it unique, and therefore not open to be imitated, and allow it to be seen in a moral light. This command is one reason why Exodus records the call of Moses in such detail. Exodus chapter 3 verse 1 through chapter 4 verse 17. Compare with Numbers chapter 12 verses 1 through 15. Believers accept God's appointment of Moses to speak his will. Without this command from God as delivered through Moses, Israel would have had no right to the land. A second point to clarify is that the Pentateuch sets out laws of warfare, distinguishing between battles fought against cities outside the Promised Land, Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 10 through 15, and those fought against cities inside the land, Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 16 through 18. It is only the latter case that requires Israel to spare no one. You shall devote them to complete destruction. See the notes on Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 1 through 20, and chapter 20, verses 16 through 18. The law appears to be unconditional and implacable. With these clarifications, one can now outline why this command is not an unsolvable problem. 1. A fundamental Old Testament conviction is that Yahweh, the God of Israel, is the creator of all there is, and therefore the owner of all lands. He has the right to distribute territories according to his good and holy will. Compare with Exodus chapter 19 verse 5, Psalm 24 verse 1. As the universal creator, he is also the universal judge, to whom all people everywhere are accountable. Compare with Genesis chapters 6 through 8. The flood story affects all kinds of people. Genesis chapter 11 verses 1 through 9. The Tower of Babel. Exodus chapter 12 verse 12. Judgment on the gods of Egypt. The prophetic oracles about the nations. See chart, page 1264. The New Testament shares this basic conviction. Compare with Acts chapter 14 verses 15 through 16, chapter 17 verses 24 through 31. This means that God has the ultimate right over the land of Canaan, and that he has the right to bring the Canaanites to judgment for their moral condition and deeds. 2. Since all people are sinners, all are rightly subject to God's judgment. The Pentateuch gives a moral rationale for the removal of the Canaanites, seeing it as divine judgment for their iniquities. See note on Genesis chapter 15 verses 13 through 16. Compare with Leviticus chapter 18 verses 24 through 30. Deuteronomy chapter 9 verse 5. This action against these peoples, then, is an expression of God's judgment on them through the agency of Israel. This judgment therefore announces the moral nature of God to the whole world for their instruction. That announcement, in all its clarity, is itself part of the blessing that Israel is to bring to the whole world. In ways that are not entirely clear, the faithful will participate with God in carrying out the final judgment. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 2. Compare with Psalm 149, verses 6 through 7. And Israel's bringing of judgment on the Canaanites foreshadows that great responsibility as well. See note on Joshua chapter 6, verse 17. God's judgment allows no double standard. He did not base his choice of Israel on any merit of theirs. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 6 through 9. And he calls them to embrace his love faithfully. Unfaithfulness will lead to judgment upon Israel itself, whether at the level of the individual, Exodus chapter 22, verse 20, or the whole people. Joshua chapter 7, verses 11 through 12, Malachi chapter 4, verse 6, compare with Leviticus chapter 18, verse 28. This cannot be called ethnic cleansing, since the treatment is just, regardless of ethnicity. 3. Further, the Sinai covenant sets Israel up to be a theocracy, a unique combination of what is now called church and state. Membership in the people is both political and religious, and thus citizens are under obligation to be faithful in observing the covenant. Those who carry out egregious violations must be removed. For example, Deuteronomy chapter 13 verse 5, chapter 17 verse 7, etc. And if Israel were to allow unrepentant Canaanites to remain in the land, they would drag the whole people down into idolatry, injustice, and evil. For example, Deuteronomy chapter 7 verse 4, chapter 12 verses 29 through 31, which sadly is just what happened. Christians are not to carry out this kind of warfare because the people of God are no longer identified with a particular nation-state. 4. Finally, even though the laws about destroying the Canaanites are stated in an uncompromising and unconditional way, in keeping with the rhetoric of ancient Near Eastern conquest accounts, which allows for this kind of unqualified statement, the way Israel applied those laws apparently made room for some of the Canaanites to surrender and survive, particularly if they professed faith in the one true God. See note on Joshua chapter 2 verse 9 for Rahab and her whole family. See note on chapter 9 verses 1 through 27 for the Gibeonites. Compare with chapter 11 verse 19. This means that the appearance of implacability in these laws is just that, an appearance, and there is an implied allowance for exceptions. This is another point showing that, strictly speaking, the command given to Israel is nothing like ethnic cleansing, since ethnicity itself is not the reason for the action. These factors, God's right to allocate land and judge the world with perfect justice, the need to protect the purity of the Israelite theocracy, and the provisions for even Canaanites to be saved, all illustrate the justice that lies behind these provisions. At the same time, it is also clear that the practices known as genocide and ethnic cleansing are indeed evil, and the Israelites were not commanded to commit them. These factors were a unique part of Israel's mission. No people today have any right to use them as a warrant to support injustice. Key themes. The book of Joshua is fascinating, not only in respect to literary and historical questions, but perhaps especially in regard to several theological topics: land, leadership, the book of the law, covenant, Yahweh's war, Hebrew kerem, judgment and mercy, divine sovereignty and human responsibility, promised rest, God's faithfulness and his people's response, and so forth. The theological lessons to glean from the pages of Joshua are many. 1. The Lord's abiding presence as the key to strength and courage. For example, chapter 1, verse 5 and 9. 2. The centrality of the Lord's instructions for succeeding in one's mission and acting with insight. Land and rest as divine gifts. Chapter 1, verses 7 through 8. 3. The ability of the Lord to save the outsider, Rahab, and the danger of the insider falling away, Achan. See chapters 2 and 7. 4. The Lord as divine warrior and the reality of judgment when iniquity is full. For example, chapter 10, verse 42, chapter 11, verses 19 through 21. 5. The danger of presumption and failure to inquire of the Lord. For example, chapter 9, verse 14. 6. The Lord as protector of the covenant. For example, chapter 10, verses 1 through 15, especially verse 11. 7. The unity of the people of God, chapter 18, verses 1 through 10, chapter 22, verse 34. 8. The sovereignty of God in giving his people place and rest, chapter 1, verse 13, chapter 11, verse 23, chapter 21, verses 43 through 45. 9. The faithfulness of God in fulfilling all his good promises, chapter 1, verse 2, chapter 21, verses 43 through 45. 10. The necessity of removing false gods and worshiping God alone, chapter 24. The list could continue. Given the virtual identity of the names Joshua and Jesus, both are rendered Jesus, Greek, Jesus, in the Greek of the Septuagint and the New Testament, and in light of passages such as Hebrews chapter 4, verses 8 through 11, it is not surprising that the leader Joshua has been interpreted as a type of Christ. History of Salvation Summary. The story of Joshua continues on from the Pentateuch as God uses Joshua's leadership of his people to give them what he had promised to the patriarchs. In such circumstances, there is even, in a limited way, blessing coming to Gentiles. In order to flourish and to fulfill their calling, the people of God require faithful leadership and faithful members. In Joshua, this mostly does happen, with a notable lapse, chapter 9, verse 14. The book closes with the people pledging continued faithfulness. The story of Israel after this time shows that their heirs did not remain faithful to this pledge, and the book warns all subsequent generations that each of them must renew this commitment. For an explanation of the history of salvation, see the overview of the Bible, pages 23 through 26. See also History of Salvation in the Old Testament, Preparing the Way for Christ, pages 2635 through 2661. Literary features. In the Hebrew canon, the book of Joshua is included, along with Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings, in the former prophets. In English Bibles, these same books are often called the historical books. Both designations are apt. The book of Joshua qualifies as historiography, history writing, but it is not like the ostensible, disinterested, largely political histories that modern secular historians write. It is, rather, a didactic history written from a prophetic, that is, theological, point of view. Multiple genres converge in the book of Joshua. The overall format is narrative or story. The specific type of story is epic, the story of a nation engaged in matters of state, including warfare. A feature of epics is the inclusion of epic catalogs, lists, and in the book of Joshua they are so extensive that the book becomes a historical chronicle in addition to an epic story. To read the book of Joshua in keeping with its literary purpose, one needs to place oneself in the narrative world of the text. Readers need to imagine themselves present at the events and take the literal, physical details seriously. They need to relish the suspense, the danger, and the plot conflicts that the storyteller puts forward. An epic presents heightened images of good and evil, and all the more so with the implied holy war motif encountered in the Old Testament. Along with the images of good and evil, there are images of heroism to admire and emulate. Finally, the reader should look not only at the world of the story and its characters, but through that world to life as it is now. Having relived the events in the story, one must ponder the recognizable human experiences and the underlying principles, especially in leadership, community, and spiritual warfare. Outline. The book of Joshua divides logically in the middle, with the first half focusing on Israel's conquest of the land of Canaan, and the second half on the distribution of the conquered territories among the Israelite tribes. Better, however, is an analysis of the book as 4 sections, each characterized by a key Hebrew word. The sound similarities between the Hebrew words yield the following pattern. Abar, cross the Jordan into the land, chapters 1 through 5. Lachach, take the land, chapters 6 through 12. Chalach, divide the land, chapters 13 through 21. Abad, serve the Lord in the land, chapters 22 through 24. 1. Crossing into the land, chapter 1 verse 1 through chapter 5 verse 15. A. Joshua's charge, chapter 1 verses 1 through 18. B. Joshua, the spies, and Rahab, chapter 2 verses 1 through 24. C. Crossing the Jordan, chapter 3 verses 1 through chapter 4 verse 24. D. Ritual renewal and divine encounter, chapter 5 verses 1 through 15. 2. Taking the land, chapter 6 verse 1 through chapter 12 verse 24. A. Jericho's fall, first fruits of war, chapter 6 verse 1 through 27. B. Israel's failure, Achan's sin, corporate guilt, chapter 7 verses 1 through 26. C. Israel's renewal, Ai's defeat, chapter 8 verses 1 through 35. D. Israel's Canaanite covenant, the Gibeonite ruse, chapter 9 verses 1 through 27. E. Defense of Gibeon, conquest of the south, chapter 10 verses 1 through 43. F. Conquest of the north and a list of defeated kings, chapter 11 verse 1 through chapter 12 verse 24. 3. Dividing the land, chapter 13 verse 1 through chapter 21 verse 45. A. It's yours, now take it, chapter 13 verses 1 through 33. B. Western territories, chapter 14 verse 1 through chapter 19 verse 51. C. A land of justice and worship, chapter 20 verse 1 through chapter 21 verse 45. 4. Serving the Lord in the land, chapter 22 verse 1 through chapter 24 verse 33. A. One nation under God, chapter 22 verses 1 through 34. B. Joshua's charge to Israel's leaders, chapter 23 verses 1 through 16. C. Covenant renewal at Shechem, chapter 24 verses 1 through 33. The setting of Joshua, circa 1406/1220 BC. The book of Joshua recounts the Israelite conquest of the land of Canaan under the command of Joshua. The book opens at Shittim with Joshua's commission from the Lord as the leader of the Israelites, progresses through his victories over the Canaanite kings and the allotment of the land, and ends with Joshua's charge to the people to remain faithful to the Lord.